sit with me for a while. You asked how to turn weakness into power. It's an honest question, one that few men dare to ask without shame. Most would rather hide their weakness behind performance than face it directly. But that avoidance comes at a cost, because the thing we hide the most is often the very thing that contains the key to our strength. Carl Jung spent his life studying the paradoxes of the psyche, the opposites that shape us, the tension between who we are and who we pretend to be. He discovered that what we call weakness is not a flaw in character, but an unlived aspect of the self, exiled to the unconscious through fear or shame. Every time we suppress an impulse, emotion, or need that once felt unsafe to express, we send it into shadow. The shadow does not disappear, it waits. And when we finally turn toward it, we discover that weakness is simply strength waiting to be integrated. So let's explore this truth through 5 transformations, 5 ways in which the energy of weakness, when understood and contained, becomes power. I'm not speaking of motivation or quick fixes, but of something deeper, the alchemy of turning the rejected into the essential, the broken into the whole. 1. From shame to ownership. The first transformation begins where most men get stuck, with shame. Weakness and shame are twin siblings. One cannot exist without the other. When a boy is told that certain parts of himself are unacceptable, his fear, his tears, his tenderness, his confusion, he doesn't stop feeling those things. He simply learns to hide them. Over time, the act of hiding becomes his personality. He builds a mask, what Jung called the persona, to gain approval and safety. But the price of that safety is disconnection from authenticity. The persona wins applause, but the man underneath feels hollow because he knows that the world is responding to the mask, not to him. The longer this goes on, the deeper the shame becomes, and the more he resists his own vulnerability. Shame says, if they see this part of me, they will leave. But ownership says, if I see this part of me, I no longer need them to approve. That is the first act of power, to own what has been hidden. Ownership does not mean glorifying your flaws or indulging in self-pity. It means reclaiming authorship of your story. It means saying, yes, this weakness exists, and I am willing to learn from it rather than be ruled by it. The moment you name your weakness without collapsing into shame, it loses its poison. What once felt like proof of inadequacy becomes a source of self-respect because it takes immense courage to see yourself without defense. Jung said that the act of becoming conscious is always painful because it requires us to bear what we used to disown. But only through that bearing does the gold appear. Ownership is the first form of power. 2. From helplessness to awareness. The second transformation occurs when we begin to see weakness not as failure but as feedback. Most forms of helplessness are not a lack of power, they're a lack of awareness. You can't change what you don't understand. And most men misunderstand the origins of their weakness entirely. They think they are lazy, undisciplined, or flawed, when in reality they are simply unaware of the unconscious forces steering them. Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That statement applies directly to weakness. What we call bad habits, emotional outbursts, or fear of success are not character defects. They are unconscious strategies developed to protect us when we were too young to know better. The man who procrastinates may have learned that initiative once led to punishment. The man who withdraws in conflict may have grown up in a household where anger was dangerous. The man who avoids intimacy may have experienced closeness as a loss of control. These are not flaws, they are adaptations. And every adaptation contains wisdom about what you once needed to survive. When you begin to view weakness through this lens, compassion replaces contempt. You realize that what you thought was broken in you was, in fact, brilliant for its time. It kept you safe, small perhaps, but safe. The problem is that those same strategies now limit you as an adult. Awareness transforms helplessness into choice. Once you see the pattern clearly, you are no longer its hostage. You can still feel fear, fatigue, confusion, but now you understand where they come from. And understanding changes everything, because awareness introduces distance between impulse and action. The moment you can observe your weakness rather than become it, you begin to rule it rather than be ruled by it. Awareness is the second form of power. 3. From dependence to integrity. The third transformation is perhaps the hardest, because it involves standing on your own feet. Weakness often hides beneath dependency, the subtle belief that someone else's approval, love, or structure will complete you. Dependency is seductive because it feels safe. It promises relief from the burden of self-responsibility. But the man who remains dependent on relationships, on validation, on external structure, cannot mature into his own authority. Jung warned that when a man gives away his power to external figures, be it a partner, a mentor, or an ideology, he becomes what he called possessed by the collective. He lives according to borrowed values. His life may look functional, but it lacks vitality because it's not self-directed. Dependency is not always obvious. Sometimes it hides behind control. A man who needs to dominate others is often just as dependent on their reactions as the man who pleads for approval. Both are trapped in the same loop, defining self-worth through others. Integrity is the turning point. It means wholeness, the alignment of thought, feeling, and action according to inner truth rather than external reward. To move from dependency to integrity, a man must begin to listen for his own voice beneath the noise of obligation. He must ask, what do I truly believe in? What do I stand for when no one is watching? Integrity is not perfection. It's the slow alignment of the inner compass. Each time you choose truth over comfort, your integrity grows stronger. Each time you take responsibility rather than blame circumstances, your authority expands. And this is the paradox. The more you rely on your own inner structure, the more capable you become of genuine connection, because your relationships are no longer transactions of need. They are meetings of equals. Integrity is the third form of power. 4. From fear to presence. Fear is perhaps the most misinterpreted form of weakness. Men often equate fear with failure. But fear is not proof that you are fragile. It is proof that you are alive and that something valuable is at stake. The problem arises when fear is left unanalyzed, when it operates in the dark. Jung saw fear as the guardian of thresholds. Every time we approach a new stage of growth, the psyche resists, not because it hates change, but because it loves safety. Fear is the body's way of asking, are you ready to bear more responsibility, more freedom, more consciousness? When you interpret fear as danger rather than invitation, you stay small. Turning fear into power begins with presence. Presence is the ability to remain aware in the midst of discomfort. It is the refusal to flee the inner battlefield. The man who can feel fear fully without retreating gains something extraordinary. He learns that he is larger than his sensations. In ordinary life, fear appears in subtle disguises. It looks like perfectionism, procrastination, cynicism, or endless busyness. These are all strategies to avoid contact with vulnerability. But once you stop negotiating with fear and simply stand in its presence, it begins to transform. What once paralyzed you starts to sharpen you. Fear loses its chaos and becomes clarity. It begins to point toward the exact areas where strength must grow. Presence is not passivity. It's command without control. It's the ability to breathe, to stay awake, to endure the intensity of transformation. The man who develops presence becomes unshakable, not because life gets easier, but because he stops abandoning himself when it gets hard. Presence is the fourth form of power. 5. From wound to wisdom. The final transformation is the one that completes all the others. Every weakness ultimately leads back to a wound. Beneath shame, fear, dependency, and helplessness lies something older, a moment when life demanded more than you could give, and you interpreted that as a flaw. Jung called this the wounded archetype. And he believed that our wounds, when made conscious, become the very source of our gift. The man who has suffered deeply, if he remains open, develops a kind of compassion and clarity that cannot be taught. His pain refines him. Turning wounds into wisdom requires humility. The humility to stop asking, why me, and start asking, what now? When you stop treating your pain as an injustice and start regarding it as initiation, everything changes. The wound no longer defines you, it instructs you. Every man who becomes wise carries a scar. The scar is not shameful, it's sacred. It is evidence that you've walked through chaos and returned with insight. It is proof that vulnerability did not destroy you, it deepened you. This is what Jung meant when he described the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who can help others because he has learned to help himself. Wisdom is not knowledge, it's metabolized experience. It's knowing in your bones that what hurts can also heal, that what breaks can also build, that what weakens can also awaken. Wisdom is the fifth form of power. 6. The cost of avoidance, the gift of integration. Every man eventually faces a choice: deny his weaknesses and repeat their consequences, or face them and integrate their lessons. Avoidance feels safe, but it breeds stagnation. Integration feels dangerous, but it breeds freedom. When you avoid your weakness, you live reactively. You overcompensate in some areas, underfunction in others, and never feel quite whole. Your relationships strain under the weight of your defenses. Your work loses meaning because it's built on performance, not purpose. You become efficient but empty, successful but restless. Integration, on the other hand, brings coherence. It's not glamorous, it's steady. It's the slow merging of opposites until strength and softness coexist, until ambition and rest stop fighting, until authority and humility can share the same space. Integration does not remove pain, it removes confusion. You stop wasting energy on pretending and start using it for creating. The man who integrates his weakness no longer fears being seen because he is no longer hiding. His presence calms others because it carries authenticity. He doesn't project perfection, he radiates humanity. And that, paradoxically, is the kind of strength the world trusts most. 7. Archetypal framing, the king and his shadow. Within the Jungian structure of masculine psychology, every archetype has a shadow. The king's shadow is the tyrant on one side and the weakling on the other. Both arise when power and vulnerability are split apart. The tyrant fears weakness so much that he destroys anything that reminds him of it. The weakling fears power so much that he abdicates responsibility entirely. Both are forms of imbalance, and both are healed only through integration. When a man learns to turn weakness into power, he begins to embody the mature king. The king doesn't eliminate his vulnerability, he governs it. He doesn't suppress emotion, he organizes it. He doesn't need constant validation because his authority comes from within. The king's power is quiet, measured, and generative. He blesses rather than controls, and his presence brings order wherever he stands. In the inner landscape, this means that the parts of you that once competed for dominance, the boy who feared, the man who performed, the critic who scorned, begin to align under one conscious will. That alignment is sovereignty. It's the realization that power and weakness are not opposites, but phases of the same current. The king archetype teaches that power without tenderness becomes tyranny, but tenderness without power becomes fragility. Integration unites them into mature presence, firm, kind, clear, and reliable. 8. Responsibility and witness. Once you begin this transformation, solitude becomes your ally. Real change rarely happens in the noise of constant distraction. It happens in the quiet, when you sit still long enough to hear your own contradictions. Solitude is not loneliness. It's the forge of clarity. But no man can sustain this work alone forever. You need witnesses, brothers, mentors, friends, men who have walked through their own fires and no longer flinch at yours. Witness prevents inflation. It keeps humility alive. Power without witness risks corruption. Weakness without witness risks despair. Together, they form the container for growth. Responsibility, then, is not a burden, but a privilege. It means you accept the stewardship of your life, no longer outsourcing it to fate, family, or circumstance. You stop waiting for rescue and begin to act as the adult your younger self always needed. You become the father to your own potential, and as you do, others feel it, not because you preach it, but because you embody it. Weakness is not the opposite of power, it is the beginning of it. The places where you feel most exposed, most uncertain, most inadequate, those are the entry points to the deeper work. If you can face them without defense, you will find that what looked like frailty was simply strength disguised as sensitivity, waiting to be trained. Do not despise your weakness. Study it. Let it teach you patience, humility, empathy, and resilience. The man who hides his weakness remains fragmented. The man who integrates it becomes whole. This is what Jung meant by individuation. The lifelong task of becoming a single, unified being. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but real, anchored, aware, and alive. You asked how to turn weakness into power. The answer is simple but never easy. You turn it by facing it. You turn it by understanding it. You turn it by refusing to run from what hurts until what once felt unbearable becomes the very source of your authority. Power that has never been tempered by weakness is fragile. Power that has been earned through the integration of weakness is unbreakable. Be that man, not perfectly, reliably begin.